These have been hard times, and this has been a particularly rough week. In less than 3 months, we've experienced a global pandemic, which has isolated and separated us. That's triggered a worldwide economic recession, which has strained and depleted us. And now, after the horrific on-camera killing of George Floyd, we've had a week of protest, anger, and unrest, which has further inflamed and unsettled us all. In the midst of such strong centrifugal forces pulling us apart, it seemed fitting to give thought to how polarization and tribalism gain strength, how it affects us, and how we can more clearly, creatively, charitably, and faithfully think and engage in the midst of it all. And ultimately, we hope to consider the question, what is our hope beyond political tribalism? We're delighted to welcome as our guest today, Dr. James Mumford, who literally wrote a book on the topic. James is a British author, scholar, and journalist who writes on a wide range of topics, including ethics, politics, sociology, and literature, for a variety of publications and on both sides of the Atlantic, including The Guardian, The Times Literary Supplement, The Spectator, The Atlantic, The Daily Telegraph, The American Conservative, The Hedgehog Review, and much more. He previously taught philosophy and ethics at the University of Virginia, where he remains a fellow at the Institute for the Advanced Study of Culture and is also a visiting fellow in the McDonald Center at Oxford. He is the author of the book Vexed, Ethics Beyond Political Tribes, which we've invited him here today to discuss. James, welcome.
Hi. Great to see you, Sherry.
So, James, what drew you to the study of the ethics of tribalism? Or were you ever tempted to join your brother's band instead, or was the allure of ethics just too great?
Yeah, the allure was just too great, I'm afraid. Music and showbiz life was not for me. So I was living in Virginia. I love America, and I've lived in the States for a number of different periods and intervals. And this last time I was in the University of Virginia, and I was teaching philosophy there and writing. And I was really just overwhelmed by the extent of political polarization that I saw. So I saw families that were divided between Republicans and Democrats. I saw faculties which had ostracized professors who were the other side of the political aisle. I saw churches that had sort of lost their way because they were so divided. And I went to dinner parties where, no one, the other end of the political spectrum had been invited, so there wasn't even any discussion. And in seeing all that, the thing that started to intrigue me was the way that a whole host of positions on moral issues had been bundled up into what I call package deals, which we then have to choose between. So, for example, I might be on the left and I might be an environmentalist, and I might, care very deeply about affirmative action. And by virtue of holding those positions, I might inherit a view that it would be wise to legalize assisted suicide, for example. Or, to give an example on the right, I might care very deeply about family values, and I might, think that it's right to care very much that it's right to be tough on crime. And I thereby inherit, because I hold those other two views, I inherit a view that we should resist gun control. And so I was intrigued by the inconsistencies, and I wanted to write about those, which is what I've done in this book.
So what leads us to accept these unusual ideological package deals? It does seem that there are some oddball combinations, both among the ones you describe in the book and really just looking around, you can tell that if you know how someone voted on, say, immigration, you can likely predict how much promise they think hydroxychloroquine has, an unusual combination. Why do we link issues as diverse as hydroxychloroquine and immigration, or gun control and abortion, or environmentalism and assisted suicide?
I think the reason are because in each case, these issues have been tacked on to other ones because of the result of coalition building by politicians pandering to different interests, trying to gather different interest groups. And I get that's what politicians have to do and are in the business of doing. But in the end, it makes for some unlikely bedfellows. And it leaves us in a situation where we have huge tensions and dissonance in the sorts of positions that we're supposed to hold because we're on one side of the political spectrum or the other. And so, for example, as many people know, it won't be news to you that, that President Nixon, employed a strategy of trying to win over the Catholic vote because of issues, because of their historic pro-life disposition of New Deal Democrats who were Catholics. And they were, moved en bloc because of President Nixon's coalition building. So that would be just one example of how one issue moved a group of people to hold a particular package deal.
Mm-hmm. So throughout your book, you discuss the potential harms of this fairly incoherent clustering of issues that you talk about. And you hold up as an ideal, I'm going to quote here, the quest to be independent-minded, to free our moral deliberation from the hold of political categories, which improves our chance of getting it right and of living in truth. But in many ways, our categories themselves often form our outlook, and our categories can actually help form the lens through which we see the world. So seeing beyond those categories can itself sometimes require moral reformation. How does one begin to see clearly and judge their categories with fresh eyes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that it's human, isn't it? It's at the core of what it means to be human, to be able to step back from our desires and to hold them up to the light and to work out if we want to identify with those and pursue those, but also to hold up to the light and step back from our beliefs and our core convictions. And it's that process of stepping back that is where I think this whole thing begins of moving beyond political tribalism. And, I think that it's also very important, this notion that I write about in the book of moral imagination. And that means that we begin by thinking about, with each of these different ethical issues, whether it be assisted suicide or whether it be the wages of the working poor, whether it be environmental catastrophe, we begin by morally imagining, or which is another term for empathy, holding in view groups that are impacted by our decisions, and thinking and by putting them first and foremost, I think that starts to shift sometimes the relation and our attitude towards various ethical questions which relate to those groups. And so I think it's about moral imagination, it's about stepping back, and finally, it's about exposing ourselves to a range of different views and to people and to their thinking that we might not reflexively warm towards.
Just to go a bit deeper with that, it's generally quite easy to spot the blind spots and inconsistencies of those we disagree with. It's a lot harder to do that with ourselves or with others that we like and agree with and already confirm our biases. Another way that often our blind spots get sanded off is just through the grittiness of living with people and spending time with people, just the inevitable sanding off of our rough spots. But in the aggregate, we are an increasingly lonely and alienated people. Far more people are living alone. And we are also increasingly sorted by our political and ideological views, such that not only do we only hang out the extent that we do with people we agree with, even our information streams are stratified. So what habits or practices do you recommend to apprehend reality more clearly?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, you know, one of the things that changed me in writing this book was trying not to pigeonhole people based on certain things that are said by them, and not thinking that because they think this, they must be that kind of person, or they must always have this kind of view about everything. And so I think I really tried to challenge myself not to pigeonhole people, but to listen more carefully to the kinds of reasoning and concerns that are behind questions. I think that was a humbling, that humbled me, that process in that way. And I also think it's really important to let the alliances fall where the alliances fall. And what I mean by that is that I think it's crucial to realize that there are issues that we can work together on with groups whose other political views we might be put off by. And it's that sort of bipartisanship that we've seen in the past and that we've lost in the present that I think is key to how we move beyond and start to see more clearly.
You know, previous guests that we've had on our online conversations have talked about liturgy, essentially repeated embodied practice, and how it forms our mind, our thinking, our loves. And so I'm curious if in the process of doing the research and writing this book, it led you to different practices or habits that you try to inculcate personally to enable you to think more creatively, coherently, and charitably towards others.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that changing your daily browser of which news sites you look at counts as liturgy, Sherry. But that's definitely one thing that I did. I tried to ensure that I wasn't just reading the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, but I was reading both, and that I was getting a range of different views from 10 or 12 different sites a day. And so that both the stories that were selected and the vantage points on those stories that were covered by both, I was being exposed to. And so that was just a little thing that I did, but I think it's made a big difference to my diet, my news diet. Yeah.
So you mentioned browser, and of course, a lot of the way that not only social media algorithms, but even the medium itself encourages us to think. It positively reinforces and rewards speed, snark, spectacle, shaming, all of which is fairly antithetical to the kind of thinking that you're talking about. So is the kind of project you describe compatible with social media use as we currently do it?
I think no, in many ways. I think that for the reasons you just said, the kind of reflection and stepping back that I'm talking about in Vexed is countercultural, and that listening to people face to face, which is tragically not as much of a possibility right now, obviously, but the sort of engagement relationally that I'm talking about, is very different from the sort of the exchange of combative exchange that we see on social media. And so it is a countercultural project, I think, to disengage, to question our own assumptions, and then also to engage with other people about their own assumptions and their own convictions and how those fit together. I think it is a countercultural practice, yeah.
So a lot of what we talked so far has been fairly intellectual, fairly heady, but there is a lot of evidence to suggest that we pick our tribes in the first place, not because we have been led there by the unquestionable march of logic and we have been convinced, but rather something about it appeals to us. And so we're drawn to it almost on a precognitive level, and then we supply intellectual justifications later. If we pick our tribe, at least partially in sort of precognitive ways, how likely is it that we're going to reason ourselves into challenging our tribe or its beliefs?
Yeah, I mean, that's so true, isn't it? And it's the argument powerfully made by Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Righteous Mind. I really feel the pull of tribalism myself. When I started writing about this book in the States, and having seen such political tribalism, when I came back to the UK, I thought, gosh, it might be a relief to have some respite, or I think you say respite, from everything that I had experienced with and with the election of President Trump in 2016. And I came back, and there had been this referendum to leave the EU. And we saw exactly the same kind of, we are seeing exactly the kind of personal, bitter tribalism here. Mm-hmm. And one of the things about that, in my experience of it, was I was quite on the fence because I missed the debate, didn't have hugely strong views on this crucial issue. I could see the arguments on both sides. But what I found is that when I was with my friends who were Remainers, I would sort of murmur approval, and I would say, isn't it awful, this right-wing insurgency? And I would agree because I wanted to be liked. I wanted to belong and have a place in the world and be part of that tribe. Mm-hmm. And then I'd be with my friends who were conservatives, and I would be nodding approval to the values of faith, flag, and family, and I would be cursing the liberal, cosmopolitan, international elite, and I was so divided, and I lacked such integrity, really, in the way that I was responding to it. And so I really feel that that it's very easy to say, oh, we need to move beyond tribalism, but in reality, we are wanting to be in groups, we're wanting places in the world, and there's something right about that desire and that appetite. But ultimately, I think the stakes are so high with some of the questions that we're facing, the ones that I've mentioned around the beginning of life or the end of life, around the kind of economic system in which working 3 different jobs may not be enough to help you and your family survive, or the kind of criminal justice system and its injustices that we see in both your country and in my country. That these issues are just too great for us to settle for taking our views and our cues from the tribes that we belong to. And so I think this kind of questioning and reshaping of the package deals at the end of the day needs to be a huge priority for us, despite this gut level affective dimension that there is to tribalism.
Yeah. So you mentioned the affective dimension, because by many measures, both expressions of tribalism in general are increasing, but also that affective dimension, that is a sense of contempt almost for the other side, it is also increasing in the last few years. And generally, when political tribes begin to hate or fear each other, they are at danger for what Madison describes, the dangers of faction, to simply sort of dig in, be less interested in compromise for the sake of the common good than victory. And I'm looking at the subtitle of your book, Ethics Beyond Political Tribes, and wondering, as you have sort of surveyed the landscape in both Britain and in the United States, where not only polarization is increasing, but the contempt with which the sides view each other is increasing. What do you think are the prospects of a common good ethics beyond political tribes?
Well, I think that there are signs for hope. And I think that, curiously, the lockdown is one of them. Because I think what we've seen, I realize that the lockdown has been, and the response to COVID has been, cynically politicized by many folks, and it has sort of, become whether or not you wear a mask is a political statement, and And you have all of that. And then you have obviously the fact that people have stayed indoors rightly because they're afraid and they want, and there's a self-preservation aspect. But I also think that what we've seen across our societies is an ability and a disposition to put the common good first, and to put the vulnerable first, and to allow that to be a curtailment of our own freedom. And that's what I really mean by this concept of moral imagination, in which resides the hope to move beyond political tribalism. So, for example, when it comes to an issue like assisted suicide, moral imagination or empathy is about holding in view that group which would be impacted by our freedom, the elderly who might be pressured to want to die and to prematurely if the assisted suicide option was on the table. And so for me, the common good and sacrifices for the common good requires always holding their good in mind, which I think leads to a real reluctance, and I think we should be very hesitant about moving in the assisted suicide direction. Mm-hmm. But I think that that's true because of these reasons, because of the common good. And so, in answer to your question, it's the hope not to stop our disagreement, but to disagree in a very different spirit, with a very different attitude, with a charity, as you began, in a charitable way, but also to put first this notion of moral imagination.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to hear more about that. But along those lines, you had talked about the inconsistencies and sort of the calcification around those inconsistencies as being a real harm to our not only individual thinking, but our public discourse. And you wrote this: the danger of inconsistency isn't just that we think the wrong way, but that we do the wrong thing. It would be great if we could dismiss inconsistency as innocuous, but the stakes could not be higher. I wanted to ask you, because of course, there are many people who have had a much more sanguine view of inconsistency. You can think about Ralph Waldo Emerson calling consistency the hobgoblin of little minds, and others. So how necessary is consistency, intellectual consistency or otherwise, for virtue?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a philosopher would probably say that it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. So it isn't enough just to be consistent, because you can have wicked worldviews like Nazism or something, which are totally consistent, but they're heinous. So it's not enough just to have our views fitting together so that we're not, pro-life when it comes to one area in our polity, but not pro-life when it comes to another area, say capital punishment. It's not enough just to say we need to be consistent. We also need to. Let me put it this way. The reason that I emphasize consistency in the book, and I think that it's a virtue, is because I think it puts us, it makes us alert to not holding views just because they've been tacked on to other ones in the course of history. That can't be the basis for why we hold convictions about these key moral and ethical, what President Obama called live rail issues. And I think the consistency or truth criterion makes us more alert to that. And that's why I think it's a virtue, but I don't think it's enough, as you say.
Mm-hmm. How have your own faith commitments affected your view of the often distorted or inconsistent political commitments and their package deals that we see so often?
Yeah, so I'm an Orthodox Christian, and I think I've felt the experience, having worked in secular academia, by which I mean not working in seminaries, most of my career. I've had the experience of always having to question my own assumptions and thinking, do I just believe this because I was raised this way? And also trying to interrogate, but also accept the good and the truth in positions from contemporaries and peers and friends in the academic world who don't share the same worldview. And I think that that's a good preparation to think about political tribalism. Mm-hmm. And I think that I would say that being first, I think that if you believe that your identity or your life is hid with Christ on high, you think that although politics might be very, very important and you can't withdraw from politics, it does mean that your identity is not primarily political, and that you're not first a Democrat or first a Republican or first a Tory or first a member of the Labour Party, but you're first a Christian. And that changes the way that you relate to political tribes, I think. It obviously creates other issues in terms of tribalism and factions within Christianity, but when we're talking about this issue of political tribalism, I think that there is a possibility and maybe the advantage of coming to something with a certain independence of mind, with a certain holding something lightly. Because I don't think it's the case that political parties, as important as they are, will ever capture the entirety of the Christian witness.
Yeah. Now, that is a fascinating point. I mean, it seems very clear that over the last several decades, many of the forms of our identity, whether rooted in our faith convictions, in our families, in our place of origin, have in many ways eroded. People are more mobile, families break up more often, faith commitments have declined. And so as different forms of our identity have eroded, the politicization of our identity has grown much more robust. And at the same time, our politics has gotten more apocalyptic. Mm-hmm. What hope do you have for reducing tribalism without the reinvigoration of other deeper forms of identity? And I guess another way of saying that is reformation possible in that area without revival?
Yeah. Well, I think that, you do, at the heart of Christian witness is the idea that you may not like your enemy, as Martin Luther King put it, but you need to love your enemy. And that affects the way that you do Twitter, and that affects the way that you do politics. And I think that it drives you to it's not possible to deny the humanity of the person who you disagree with, who belongs to the other tribe. Mm-hmm. And so is it possible to have a kind of discourse that is more civil without a radical change in heart? I don't think I know the answer to that question. Mm-hmm. I think that there is something about the nature of civil discourse, which does have its roots not only in the Enlightenment, but in liberal, in the strict sense of the word, in terms of its emphasis on freedom, in liberal Christian political thought. And I think that's an important legacy. And I think that's an important inheritance. And I think that insofar as in that way, overcoming tribalism has and the moral imagination required for that is rooted in a certain kind of Christianity.
Great. Well, we are at the top of the hour, so we're going to turn to questions from our viewers. And as Alyssa explained earlier, not only can all of our viewers ask a question, but you can also like a question that has been asked. And the more a question is liked, the more likely it is that it will be able to be answered during our next half hour. So I see we have a bunch of questions stacked up. Our first question comes from an anonymous attendee who asks, how can we convince each other that voting in elections based on our deepest moral convictions is always better than mindlessly following those we see as our political or tribal leaders?
Yeah, well, that really it puts more articulate than I've done in the book. The core message of Vexed, of this book. I think that it comes back to this notion of calling each other to be the best possible human beings we can be, in stepping back from our tribes, and in thinking about the kinds of consequences on the most vulnerable and on the poorest of our political decisions and of the decisions that we make about ethics. And I think it's so I think it's about calling each one of us to step back from our inherited views and to think about to think as rationally as we can about the issues that we face.
So one anonymous attendee asks, what is the most objective news source available today?
The most objective news source available. That is, I don't think I could think of one of the most objective news source available. I think that, it's just crucial to, the Englishman in me would want to talk about the BBC, but that would be very much criticised by people on the right in this country. So the BBC is fantastic now, but I think it's just to go back to what I said. It's the importance of having. It's okay to have biased news sources. You just have to balance them out with other biased news sources.
Our next question comes from Peter Petit, who asks, these days we think of making statements on social media as being engaged in the public square. Do you think that is true?
That is a good question. I don't think it really counts. It's not compared to some of the things our parents and our peers have done, as in the kind of costs that they've suffered from the kind of political protests you saw against the Vietnam War in your country, the kind of protests against nuclear weapons and CND in this country, the kind of, when we think about the history of non-violent protest in America, to then equate a Twitter post with that seems somewhat preposterous. So I take the force of that point, indeed.
So Jenny Savage asks, how do I question my own assumptions? I.e., what questions do you suggest I ask myself about my beliefs?
I think some of the key questions to ask are about, let me try and think of an example. Who's affected by some of the beliefs that I have about the assumptions that I have. So this issue of assisted suicide isn't it, just to come back to that one. In thinking about the right to die, we don't always think about that group that would be affected by the legalization of that right, or as has gone ahead in California. And so part of the issue is thinking about who is affected in some of those certain cases. But it isn't always going to be that, because that makes me sound very, to use philosophical jargon, consequentialist. But it's part of the answer.
Our next question comes from Maya Maley, who says, both of you have incredible bookshelves behind you, including your book, James. What other classic or modern text would you encourage us to read on this topic?
I think there are I think the book To Change the World by James Davison Hunter is a great book, which obviously he wrote Culture Wars. And so in my book, I try to follow the symmetry that he strictly adheres to in criticizing the left as much as criticizing the right in equal measure. And, he does that in Culture Wars, and then he does that also in To Change the World. And I think he does that brilliantly. In terms of a moral imagination, I take that phrase from a literary critic called David Bromwich, and his essay, Moral Imagination, for the literary journal Raritan, was a big influence on my book.
You were speaking of culture wars a moment ago, and our next question comes from an anonymous attendee who asks, does tribalism inevitably lead to a militancy and a culture war?
I don't think, it depends if we're using the word tribalism to already describe the militancy, or if the fact that people belong. I don't think that, as we were discussing, necessarily leads to what we're seeing at the moment. I think we'd have to be quite fatalistic to think that, and to think that the only way we could undo and go back on where we are at the moment in terms of the bitter partisanship is if people no longer identified with groups or imaginary communities. So I think that there must be a way of identifying with groups, of thinking that, I am a conservative, or I am progressive, and that there are certain principles that are important to me, but not thinking that means that I have to accept the whole package deal. Mm-hmm. There must be a way forward on that. Yeah,
that's great. So our next question comes from Bob Freiling, who asks, how does one work with arguments of false equivalencies that often end up with a lack of agreement, or at least understanding of what is predominantly true?
Could you just repeat that one more time?
Sure. How does one work with arguments of false equivalencies that often end up with a lack of agreement or understanding of what is predominantly true?
Yeah, so I suppose what might mean by false equivalences, the sort of I don't quite understand that question, actually. Sorry.
Oh, I guess just in general, dealing with arguments about false equivalencies, when you're trying to get at the truth, how does one deal with that? The tendency to equate, well, your side does this, the tendency towards the essentially the Middle East blood feud between two different sides that kind of sees, that equates perhaps something fairly heinous with something relatively innocuous, which seems to be a characteristic of a lot of the rhetoric that we have.
Yeah, I see. That makes more sense. Yeah, and how do we avoid that? I think we have to, paint more detail and pay more attention to the detail of the thing which is which is in question and is being made to being equated with another thing. Mm-hmm. And we have to, it takes time, doesn't it, to establish why something, might be an equivalent act and why it may not be. Mm-hmm. And I think that comes back to your point about this isn't sometimes the kind of work that you can do on Twitter, but this is the sort of work that requires greater reflection.
So Roger Trigg asked this. He says, on both sides of the Atlantic, universities appear to be encouraging tribalism by not insisting that students consider alternative positions if they are offended by them. This did not used to be the case. What can be done?
Yeah, I think, is it Robin?
Roger Trigg.
Roger makes an excellent point. We're seeing the pressure on free speech in this country, in university contexts. And it means that certain views don't get airings because they are seen to trigger and seen to take, cause offense. I think that we have to realize why it's important. We don't want to give license to talking in particularly vicious ways about subjects, and we want to make sure that free speech doesn't become license for vitriol and for making arguments in ways that are deeply offensive. But we also want to allow space for dissident views to exist, because when dissident views don't exist, we know that we're in trouble, and we're in some of those realities that Orwell described and that we experienced in the 20th century. And so I think Roger's right to be concerned about that issue. And I think it's important for us to realize that, holding a certain view, I think, here's the other point about that. Holding a certain view doesn't mean that you disdain the people that you're talking about in the view.
Yeah. So there's a poignant question from an anonymous attendee who says, do you think we have moved beyond the point where secular, political, cultural, and social solutions can fix the country? Is even the gospel insufficient in the world today? It certainly seems that way. I'd like your comments.
Yeah, well, after the week that you've had, and it doesn't seem like it seems like a necessary but a testing time to talk about hope beyond political tribalism. And I'm so sorry for this, extraordinary thing that you, and grief that you are experiencing in your culture at this time. But I think that that this is time for thinking about hope, and I think it's time for thinking about how we move people beyond being stuck in these tribal these tribal grooves that we've got into. And I think that the gospel does still have resonance, because I think that whilst on the one hand, like I said, it's, being committed to the gospel means not thinking that politics is the most important thing. Being committed to the gospel also means that you can't take the withdrawal from the world option seriously. Mm-hmm. And so it's not really an option. And I think that we see enough of the significance of the gospel when it pervades and trickles down into a culture. We see enough fruit from that to think that even in this kind of situation, the gospel can bear fruit and lead to more just social situations.
So one of our viewers, Lawrence Lamb, wrote in, I don't fit any tribe. I run left on healthcare and environment and run right on social and fiscal policy issues. I'm also an evangelical and hold a PhD with fellowships in molecular biology. All contrast. Is it possible for those such as I to have a voice in the midst of this cacophony? What would you suggest?
I'd suggest starting your own political party. I'd suggest, I think, one thing we haven't talked about is how an electorate reshapes and reshapes the political alternatives. And I think it's people like, and what was their name again?
Lawrence.
I think it's people like Lawrence that are so crucial to creating new groups around new kinds of formations of positions, mm-hmm. which those in power and our representatives will respond to. I think that's a major source of that could be a major source of hope. because I, like Lawrence, don't really feel that I fit in either. And I want a politics that represents me better.
Mm-hmm. So a provocative question from David Durham, who asks, at what point do you think evangelicals in particular began to vilify the practice of questioning conventional wisdom, and why?
At what point do evangelicals
begin to vilify the practice of questioning conventional wisdom, and why?
Do you get that question?
I think he is asking if you believe there was a time that the practice of questioning conventional wisdom fell out of favor among evangelicals.
Oh, I see. Yes. I'm not sure I know enough about American religious history to answer that question. I think, when you think about the mid-century and you think about I've mentioned pro-life Democrats earlier in your program, I think that there was a calling to account that happened at that point, and among the Catholic Church. He's asking about evangelicalism, but a calling to account between those years of 1945 and 1960, when the Catholic Church was leading and America and the world was responding before the 60s to issues around international human rights. And I think that counted as a very important moment in which that conventional wisdom was challenged by a religious group. I think obviously since the culture wars and since Nixon and since the late 80s, you've seen a different kind of pattern, but it's not really it's not I don't think it's necessarily my place to comment on American religious history and mistakes that evangelicals may or may not have made.
Fair enough. So our next question comes from an anonymous attendee, and I think this is a question that a lot of us have sort of wrestled with. They ask, considering the difficulty in developing real dialogue on social media that you spoke to earlier, how can we best persuade others and challenge their thinking in a productive manner during quarantine?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it's maybe about liking and forwarding and distributing arguments that are made in ways that are charitable, like you said. I think it's the kind of things that we give air to through social media and that we encourage other people to give air to. Mm-hmm. And for example, I think it's important that we always take those we disagree with at their best, and that we don't just reduce them to their most absurd, but we really, and so I think that has, I think our language, our use of language is, changes when we do that. And I think that, so I'm not saying that, I'm saying it's very countercultural, as you said, the sort of engagement and reflection I'm talking about. But I don't think it means we should all, shut down our Twitter accounts. I just think it means even there we could do things more redemptive. We could do things redemptively.
Mm-hmm. A follow-up question from another anonymous viewer who asked, in your observation, what are the best ways to go about persuading someone or trying to change their mind?
I like, pointing towards sources which are independent just of me. So it's not just me explaining the view, but it's me pointing towards a particular video or a particular podcast or a particular article or book, which gives the position that you're advocating at its best, so that there's some distance between. So if they accept or reject that, they're not accepting or rejecting you. there's a certain distance or objective distance and so I think it's about hunting for resources. I think that's personally how I like to engage with people, rather than just making it about the triumph of my own brilliance, which will obviously not end up triumphing over them either.
One never knows. So our next viewer, Anonymous, asks, how did writing this book shape and change who you are and how you personally think?
Yeah, in lots of different ways. I think, like I said before, it's changed the way that I think about a number of different issues in doing research on economic uncertainty and the way that Labour has, over the last generation, not captured productivity gains like capital has. That's made me think much more deeply about economic issues, and the research there has sort of transformed the way I think about the working poor. I think that in terms of my relation to people, I hope that I pigeonhole people less, and I hope that I've become better at listening. Yeah.
Great. So this next question comes from John Saylor, who asks, are you hoping to eliminate package deal ethical frameworks or to reconfigure them? When you talk about political tribalism, it sounds like you're saying that there's something problematic by nature about these package deals. At the same time, you point out that many of these package deals are merely inconsistent. We need better ones rather than to eliminate them. Curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, that really gets to a nub of the question that I was pressed on by lots of friends and colleagues when I was writing the book, because in ending up having particular views on, say, controversial things like the beginning and the end of life, or the environment, or I have a chapter on sexual consumerism and materialism. Like, I do end up coming down on certain lines and taking certain positions, and if you add up those different positions, you get to a bundle of views. And so from one point of view, to say anything substantive in a book will mean that you offer a different kind of package of positions. But I think what I'm trying to say is that how we reach those positions is vital, and that through a process of reflection and thought and engagement with the world in a more personal way, we end up with different group of positions which don't map on identically to political platforms of parties which have been scooped up in the contingency in contingent historical circumstances. And so it's the sort of why. So that's what I'm trying to capture in the word package. That I don't. They're not just a package deal,
So our next question comes from an anonymous attendee who says, even if an individual can be consistent and unbundle certain issues in her own mind, what does she do with that, given that the political parties will continue to bundle inconsistent issues in efforts to build coalitions?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing I'm trying to say in Vexed is it's not just about politics. It's not just about the book. It's not just about how we should vote. It's about how we should live, and how we relate to these different issues, and to how we make decisions in our own lives about what we do with our wallets and what we do with our bodies, and about sex and the beginning of life and obligations to our parents, and all of these different fronts that we're engaged in. I think that we shouldn't be taking our cues from these package deals, and we shouldn't be governed. And so in some ways, what I'm saying is kind of apolitical. But in other ways, going back to what I said in answer to the question a couple of questions ago, I think that, ultimately we should be trying to pressure politicians to represent us better and to reshape their offers to us.
Mm-hmm. So a question from Giff Thornton, who asks, I sense that tribes are picking and choosing elements of the gospel to support their positions, rather than going to the gospel to define how they think and arrive at political positions. How do we combat that?
Yeah, well, I think, the question of the sorts of political positions, ethical positions one can, and how one derives those from the scriptures and how one derives those from the gospel is obviously an enormous question. But I think that there is a certain consistency to Christian witness when it comes to, say, the value of life, and to impress the revolution that occurred. Then Tom Holland writes about this in his new book, Millennium. The revolution that occurred when Christianity brought into view this new apprehension and appreciation for the dignity of every man, woman, and child. I think that is a driving force behind Christian ethics, which does impose a certain unity on positions. And I think that giving a sense of that is really helpful in talking about ethics and how you derive those from the scriptures.
Great. Well, we have far more questions, but the witching hour is almost upon us, so we'll just take one more question from our viewers, which comes from Tim Carroll, who asks, do you think that multicultural churches could be a major step forward against polarization?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think that, multicultural, they provide a picture of what it's like to live with differences, and I think that is beautiful. They are beautiful pictures of that. The reality of how that comes about in spaces where there's much more segregation on the ground in communities in Britain and communities in the United States, that's a tall order. But where they do exist, I think they do provide a beautiful picture of that. Yes, absolutely. My favorite poet, he was an American, despite the fact that he wanted to be a Brit, T.S. Eliot, said that right action is freedom from past and future also. And I think that getting it right on our ethics is a freedom from the way that past political configurations have determined things for us. And so I think there's a real freedom in moving beyond tribalism and thinking again about some of these issues.
James, thank you for that, and thank you for joining us. To all of our viewers, thank you for the compliment of your time and attention. Have a great weekend.